The air was thick and cold, smelling of salt, coal smoke, and the faint metallic tang of fear. For 17 days, Elias O'Connell had lived in the perpetual twilight of the steerage hold, the ceaseless groan of the SS. Killarney's hull his only constant companion. Now he stood pressed against the railing, his breath frosting in the late autumn chill, gazing upon the impossible emerald hue of America. But it was not the towering skyline of Manhattan that first captured his attention. It was the red brick fortress of Ellis Island. It sat like a customs house at the gates of paradise, an imposing, necessary barrier. Elias clutched the single, battered valise that contained everything he owned. One threadbare suit, a prayer book, and a miniature, tarnished copper key, a keepsake from a life he was desperate to leave behind. He was one of thousands, mostly Irish and Italian, shuffling toward the massive main building, an anonymous face in a tide of hopeful, hungry souls. The noise inside the great hall was deafening, a chaotic symphony of a dozen languages echoing off the vaulted ceilings. 1,000 different conversations, cries, and commands swirled together, punctuated by the sharp thud of stamps on official papers. This was the true test, the moment the dream could either be validated or violently ripped away. The room didn't feel like a gateway. It felt like a vast, impersonal machine designed to sort, categorize, and pass judgment. Elias joined the long, snaking line for the medical inspection. His eyes swept over the stern-faced doctors, who moved with a robotic efficiency, marking coats with chalk if they suspected any illness. He had heard the stories, tales of immigrants being turned back for a cough, a limp, or the dreaded, swift E for eyes if they showed signs of trachoma. A sudden, paralyzing anxiety seized him. He straightened his back, forced his shoulders down, and practiced a look of healthy indifference. He could not fail. He had promised his mother. When he finally stood before the doctor, the moment passed in a blur. "Name? Elias O'Connell, sir." His voice cracked, rough from the sea air and lack of use. "Age, 19. The doctor, a man with a tired, expressionless face, pulled down Elias' lower eyelids with a hooked instrument, a second, terrifying check for trachoma. The pressure was firm, but the inspection was over in 2 seconds flat. He grunted, then motioned the young man toward the next line. "Next." Elias didn't wait to be told twice. He gathered his valise and hurried away, his heart hammering against his ribs, only releasing his breath once he reached the separation pens. He had passed the first hurdle. But as he looked across the water toward the shimmering promise of Manhattan, he knew the true weight of Ellis Island was not the granite and brick he stood upon. It was the invisible burden of expectation, the crushing understanding that he was now alone, indebted to this new land, and that his survival depended entirely on the strength of his own 2 hands. His new life had begun, not with a welcome, but with a judgment. Elias stepped off the ferry onto the soil of Manhattan, and the city instantly assaulted his senses. It was a cacophony of iron wheels on cobblestones, shouting newsboys, the clang of streetcars, and the pervasive stench of fish, human waste, and unwashed wool. New York was a creature of relentless motion, a direct, brutal contrast to the silence and slow starvation of his home village. His home, or what was left of it, had been in County Cork, a place where the landscape itself seemed to mourn. He carried the indelible memory of the Ngorda Moor, the Great Hunger, not as a history lesson, but as a deep, chilling ache in his bones. He was born just as the blight was easing, but the echo of the famine was in every gaunt face, every abandoned field, and every desperate, hushed story told around a meager fire. His father, a small tenant farmer, had survived the worst, only to lose the lease during the subsequent economic ruin. The small, tarnished copper key Elias carried was not a key to a vault, but to the front door of their whitewashed cottage, a door that had been locked forever behind them. "You must go, Elias," his father had commanded, his voice raw with defeat. "We are only the ghosts of a life here. The soil has forgotten us. America, it still remembers how to grow." The historical context of his arrival in the late 1890s placed him squarely in the massive wave of immigration, yet he was still viewed as an intruder by many. He wasn't just poor, he was Irish, a distinction that carried with it centuries of prejudice and recent memories of urban unrest. The city was already teeming with his countrymen, but instead of finding immediate solace, he found brutal competition. His first hours were spent navigating the labyrinthine streets toward the notorious 5 Points neighborhood, a name whispered in both fear and necessity. Every corner seemed to hold an opportunity for disaster. He saw the hastily scrawled signs tacked to lampposts, advertising jobs that paid barely enough for a bowl of gruel, often ending with the casual, cruel disclaimer, "No Irish need apply." This sign was the first true slap of the New World. It was a clear, bold message that the dream he had crossed an ocean for was guarded not just by doctors and papers, but by the ingrained hostility of those who had arrived before him. The famine had robbed him of his home. This prejudice threatened to rob him of his future. He reached the crowded, chaotic entrance to a lodging house, a place where exhausted men slept shoulder to shoulder on pallets for a nickel a night. Standing in the doorway, Elias took in the scene of desperation. The ragged clothes, the hollowed eyes, the men who looked like specters from his own past. He realized that the ships sailing to America had simply transported the famine's echo from the potato fields of Cork to the tenements of New York. Survival here was a solitary, vicious calculation. He gripped his valise tighter, the small copper key digging into his palm, a reminder that he was no longer just Elias O'Connell. He was a fragment of a destroyed past, searching for fertile ground in this unforgiving city. Elias secured his lodging in a building on Mulberry Street, deep within the notorious neighborhood. It was a 6-story structure, known grimly to the locals as a lung block, a term whispered because of the high rates of tuberculosis and disease that thrived in the airless courts and damp rooms. The room he shared with 5 other men was no larger than a farmer's pantry, perpetually shrouded in a twilight gloom, even at midday. The single window offered no view of the sky, only the opposing wall of the narrow air shaft, which served as a chimney for the tenement's collective odors. Sweat, stale cabbage, unemptied chamber pots, and the acrid smell of burnt lamp oil. The rent, collected weekly by a squat, impassive landlord, was extortionate for the square footage, but it was a roof. And a roof, Elias reminded himself, was a luxury his family no longer possessed. His search for work began immediately and ended almost as quickly. The honest labor advertised on the dockyards or in the burgeoning factories was consistently denied to him by the ubiquitous "No Irish need apply" signs. He swallowed his pride and took the only work available, a hog scavenger. His job, for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, was to follow the municipal herds that roamed the streets of the Lower East Side, clearing the refuse and swill they left behind. The pay was 25 cents a day. He calculated meticulously, 15 cents for his cot, 5 cents for a bowl of watery stew, and 5 cents to save. Progress was measured in pennies, and the thought of earning enough to send a shilling home to Cork seemed like a fool's fantasy. The harshest reality of the tenement was the constant presence of shadows, both literal and metaphorical. Sunlight rarely pierced the gloom, leaving the interior hallways slippery with moisture and fear. The metaphorical shadows were the threats that lurked in the darkness. On his 3rd night, a man's pocketknife found his meager savings, vanishing the hard-earned nickel he'd planned for the week's stew. He learned quickly that sympathy was non-existent and trust was lethal. The building itself was a crucible of desperation. Families were packed into single rooms, grandmothers, parents, and children sleeping head to toe. The constant sound of weeping, arguing, and coughing filtered through the thin walls. Elias watched the children, pale and aged beyond their years, playing games in the street muck. They were not children of the Great Hunger, but children of the American slum, a different kind of famine. One evening, exhausted and smelling faintly of the city's refuse, Elias sat on the edge of his cot, polishing the small copper key. He had a deep, burning resentment for the man who had stolen his nickel, but a deeper hatred for the system that made the theft necessary. He was not just fighting for money. He was fighting to keep the shadow of the tenement from enveloping his soul, from turning him into the same defeated, hollow-eyed man he saw staring back at him from the filthy glass of the hall mirror. He needed a connection, a way out of the dead-end labor and the predatory darkness. He understood now that survival in this city required more than just hard work. It required cunning, influence, and perhaps a willingness to break a few of the very laws he had been raised to revere. The tenement's shadow was long, but Elias decided he would not spend his life crouching in its corners. The encounter didn't take place in a respectable hall or a clean office, but beneath the leaking canopy of a saloon known as the Blind Pig, just off Chatham Square. Elias had sought refuge there one bone-chilling evening, spending one of his precious nickels on a glass of thin, lukewarm ale, hoping the alcohol would momentarily dull the perpetual ache in his muscles. He was sitting alone, his exhaustion obvious, when the noise level in the bar abruptly surged. A man had taken a position on an overturned wooden crate in the corner, holding court with a small, captivated audience of dockworkers and laborers. The man was a stark contrast to the haggard clientele. He was powerfully built, with a shock of unruly red hair and eyes that burned with a manic, captivating intensity. His clothes were worn but clean, and his voice, though rough, carried a theatrical resonance that commanded attention. This was Brendan "Red" McBride, and he was known in the 5 Points not for selling drinks or working docks, but for selling revolution. "They tell you, gentlemen, that this is the land of opportunity," Red roared, slamming his fist onto the crate. The ale glasses rattled. "They mean the opportunity for them to fatten their wallets on your bending backs. Look around you. Are we not working 12 hours? Are we not sleeping 6 to a room? Did we cross an ocean to exchange the king's tyranny for the banker's greed?" Elias, usually cautious and withdrawn, found himself drawn into the circle. Red wasn't talking about abstract politics. He was talking about the smell of the tenement, the gnawing hunger, and the injustice of the "no Irish" signs Elias had come to hate. "The men who own the factories, the men who own the piers, they do not care about your soul," Red continued, his voice dropping slightly, now a conspiratorial whisper that somehow carried through the room. "They care about the sweat that pours from you onto their ledger sheets. They call us Paddy, Mick, and scum. They don't see men, they see fuel." As Red concluded his fiery sermon with a promise of organized resistance, the men cheered, tossing a few coins into a battered hat that lay at his feet. Elias, however, stood silent, a skeptical frown creasing his brow. When the small crowd dispersed, Elias approached cautiously. "You speak well," he said, the words heavy with his Cork accent. "But words do not pay the rent, Mr. McBride." Red turned, his intense gaze locking onto Elias. He didn't seem offended. Instead, a slow, calculating smile spread across his face. "Ah, a man who understands leverage," Red said, his voice now lower, devoid of the theatrical flourish. He gestured toward Elias' workingman's coat stained with refuse. "You smell like the city's underbelly, son. What's your name?" "Elias O'Connell, I'm a scavenger." Red leaned closer, resting an elbow on the crate. "You look too sharp to be scraping refuse, Elias. You have the look of a man who listens, not just shouts. The fight for fair wages for a respectable day's work, it needs more than just noise. It needs eyes and ears. It needs men who can move through the shadows unseen." He offered his hand, a powerful, calloused grip. "I don't just rant for sport, boy. I'm building something. Something that will take this city back, brick by brick. Are you ready to stop cleaning up after the pigs and start fighting the real animals?" The question hung in the stale saloon air. Elias looked at the man's earnest, burning eyes. This was the opportunity he'd been looking for, a dangerous door perhaps, but a door nonetheless, leading out of the tenement's shadow. He took the offered hand. Red McBride didn't lead Elias into a fight against the establishment. He led him directly into its heart. The organization Red was building was not a union of pure-minded reformers, but a faction operating within the shadow of Tammany Hall, the democratic political machine that dominated New York City. "You don't defeat a beast by attacking its claws, Elias," Red explained one evening. As they walked through the bustling, lamplit corridors of the Tammany Wigwam, the organization's headquarters. "You control the feeding trough." To Elias, who had fled a land where political power was used to enforce starvation, the hall was an unsettling spectacle. It wasn't the den of thieves he might have imagined. It was a well-oiled social welfare system disguised as a political clubhouse. On one floor, they distributed coal to freezing families. On another, they provided rudimentary job training. On a third, ward bosses, known as sachems, sat behind polished desks, listening to the grievances and requests of their constituents. The air in the wigwam was thick with cigar smoke and the low, constant hum of deal-making. Red's role was complex. He was not a traditional boss, but a potent agitator who kept the immigrant working class loyal, or at least manageable. He used his fiery rhetoric to funnel votes to Tammany-approved candidates, ensuring the machine maintained control. In return, Red received patronage, the power to influence who got certain construction jobs, who was protected from the police, and crucially for Elias, a way out of scavenging. "You're not working the docks yet, boy," Red murmured to Elias, guiding him through a crowded reception. "You're working the election districts. You're my eyes and ears among the newcomers. Find out who needs what." A basket of food, a citizenship paper pushed through, a word to the police to ignore a little street gambling. That's the currency here. Elias quickly understood the mechanics of the corruption. It was not arbitrary, it was transactional. Tammany provided immediate, tangible relief to the poor. a turkey for Thanksgiving, help with a funeral, in exchange for an absolute political debt. Their vote. The system was insidious because it preyed on genuine need, making the poor complicit in their own political subjugation. His duties led him into the darkest corners of the city, from the Jewish ghettos of the Lower East Side to the Italian enclaves below Canal Street. He wasn't collecting votes, he was collecting favors. One night, a local ward boss, a corpulent man named Fitzwilliam, cornered Elias. "MacBride tells me you're quick, boy. Quick to listen, quick to move. But remember this, O'Connell, the machine runs on grease. You take the grease, you vote the ticket, and you keep your mouth shut about what the grease is made of. We are the ones who put the bread on your table, not God. Don't ever forget that." The implied threat was clear. Elias was no longer just a victim of circumstance. He was a pawn in a sophisticated game. He accepted a small, steady salary, enough to move out of the shared cot and into a tiny, less crowded room. He felt a profound moral discomfort, but the money and the sense of belonging were addictive. He was no longer starving, no longer shivering, and no longer invisible. Holding the small, tarnished copper key in his pocket, his one tangible connection to a moral past, Elias recognized the grim bargain he had struck. The famine had taught him survival. Tammany Hall was teaching him power, and the terrifying lesson that to rise above the shadow, he first had to learn how to live in it. The crucial turning point came not in a backroom deal, but in the grime and chaos of the West Side docks, in the fierce rivalry between the longshoremen loyal to Tammany and a small, independent union trying to break the machine's stranglehold. Red MacBride, the firebrand, was tasked with suppressing the dissent. He was the machine's iron fist wrapped in a working man's glove. Elias had been a useful observer, reporting who attended the rival meetings and who was swayed by the promises of true reform. But on a freezing December night, observation was not enough. "They're organizing a strike at Pier 17 tomorrow," Red told Elias, his face hard in the gaslight of their small office. "A show of strength. We need to stop it before the sun rises. We need to send a message that costs more than words." Red handed Elias a heavy oak cudgel, a shillelagh, as Red called it with a grim smile. "You don't just watch tonight, O'Connell. You act, the ones who lead the protest. They need to be reminded who feeds them and who starves them. This is not for money, boy. This is for loyalty. This is for your future." Elias hesitated, the weight of the cudgel feeling like a blasphemy in his hand. He had suffered violence, but he had never inflicted it. He thought of his mother's solemn face, the values etched into him back in County Cork. "We are not fighters, Elias. We are survivors. They're just men seeking better wages," Elias murmured, his voice tight. Red's hand clamped down on Elias' shoulder with bruising strength. "In this city, Elias, there are no just men. There are allies and there are enemies. An enemy is someone who threatens our ability to eat. Do you want to go back to scraping hog refuse? Do you want to go back to being a ghost in the tenement? They will break us all if they break the machine." That night, under the shadow of the silent, waiting ships, Red and a small crew, including a deeply conflicted Elias, ambushed the strike leaders in a dark alleyway near the pierhead. The fight was swift, brutal, and ugly. It wasn't a fair fight. It was an execution of loyalty. The sound of splintering wood and desperate grunts echoed off the warehouse walls. Elias, driven by a primal fear and Red's fierce, guttural commands, found himself swinging the cudgel. He didn't aim to kill, but he aimed to silence, to maim, to send the devastating message Red had demanded. He felt the sickening impact of the wood against flesh and bone, a sound that would replay in his nightmares for years. When the chaos subsided, the alley was silent, save for the ragged breathing of Red's crew and the groans of the defeated men scattered on the cobblestones. Elias stood over a fallen man, his knuckles raw and his chest heaving. A thin smear of blood, not his own, stained the sleeve of his coat. Red walked over, inspecting the damage with professional detachment. He looked at Elias, his fiery eyes approving. "You did what needed doing, son. You chose a side." He didn't need a signature or a handshake. The choice Elias made, the act he committed, was the seal of their alliance. It was a pact made in blood. The copper key in his pocket suddenly felt heavier, colder, a relic of an innocence irrevocably lost. He was no longer a newcomer seeking shelter. He was an operative of the machine. The door to his past had slammed shut, locked now not by a landlord, but by his own terrible decision. The reward for Elias' loyalty, the price paid for the blood pact, was a job on the construction of the new elevated railway, the L. Red MacBride pulled the necessary strings with ward boss Fitzwilliam, securing Elias a position as a structural laborer. It was a brutal change from scavenging, but the brutality was honest. It was a baptism by steel and sweat. The work was terrifying. Elias spent his days hundreds of feet above the city streets, balancing on narrow crossbeams, the wind whipping past his ears as he helped hoist immense steel girders into place. The ground below was a dizzying blur of trolleys and horse-drawn traffic. One slip, one moment of vertigo, and the tenement's shadow would claim him forever. His mentor was a grizzled foreman named Seamus, an older Irishman who had seen countless men come and go, some to the city morgue, others to foreman positions. Seamus didn't care about Tammany politics. He cared only about precision and strength. "You don't hold the beam with your hands, O'Connell," Seamus barked over the roar of a nearby pile driver. "You hold it with your spine. If you doubt the steel for a second, it'll feel it and it'll drop you. Trust the steel, trust your brothers, and trust nothing else." Elias learned fast. The intense physical labor was a cleansing fire, burning away the shame of the previous night's violence. Every evening he would collapse onto his cot, his muscles trembling, but his mind clear. He slept the sleep of the truly exhausted, a profound contrast to the shallow, fear-ridden rest he had experienced while living in the depths of the 5 Points. He developed a new kind of currency, calluses, not nickels. His hands became thick and hardened, the rough skin eventually covering the permanent indentation the copper key made when he gripped his fist. He learned the specific weight and leverage needed to guide a 12-foot beam into its final resting place, the deafening clang as it settled becoming the soundtrack to his new life. Beyond the physical strength, Elias learned the trade, the complex math of stress load, the physics of suspension, and the intricate language of the ironworkers. He studied the blueprints Seamus left scattered in the construction shack, tracing the geometric patterns that would soon carry thousands of New Yorkers. He began to see the city differently, not as a chaotic mass of desperation, but as a vast, magnificent puzzle of steel, granite, and human ingenuity. He was not just surviving. He was building a permanent part of the American landscape. One afternoon, a rookie miscalculated a chain load, causing a heavy crane cable to snap and whip back. Seamus, preoccupied, was directly in the path. Without thought, Elias lunged forward, tackling the foreman to the safety of a nearby platform, the cable slicing the air where Seamus's head had been moments before. Seamus didn't offer praise. He simply dusted himself off, his face etched with grudging respect. "You got good eyes, O'Connell, and better nerve. You're not just a laborer, you're starting to see the bones of the city." That night, Elias looked up at the skeletal frame of the L, bathed in the moon's cold light. He was still connected to the shadows of Tammany Hall, still bound by the pact he had made. But now, he was also defined by the steel he helped raise. The apprenticeship had done more than give him a wage. It had given him a skill, a purpose, and a small, hard-won piece of dignity. He was transforming the sweat of his brow into the foundation of a new life. Elias had been on the construction crew for nearly a year, long enough for the city's rhythm to move from a frantic assault to a familiar, if still dangerous, cadence. He had money in his pocket, a skill in his hands, and the terrible protection of the Tammany machine over his head. He had begun to believe the scaffolding was his permanent shield. Then came the whispers. They started subtly in the crowded, smoke-filled saloons, not as shouts of revolt, but as anxious murmurs. Banks were closing in Philadelphia. Railroads were defaulting on loans. The price of silver, the very foundation of much of the West's economy, was collapsing. This wasn't local street corruption. This was a tremor originating from the very foundation of the nation's wealth, the Panic of 1893. The signs appeared first on the docks. Ships sat idle, cargo remaining unloaded. Then the factories began to slow down. One morning, half the shifts at the textile mills were canceled. Soon, the newsboys were hawking papers with headlines screaming of unemployment and ruin. The panic was a financial blizzard, and New York, the economic engine of the country, was quickly becoming buried in snowdrifts of debt and despair. On the elevated railway construction site, the mood shifted from focused purpose to nervous speculation. The city government, pressured by a sudden lack of credit and plunging tax revenues, began to cut back. The constant roar of the pile drivers grew intermittent. Seamus, the iron-willed foreman, started looking less like a mentor and more like a harried manager. "They're freezing the city budget, Elias," Red McBride informed him one rainy afternoon, his usual fire dampened by genuine worry. Red's control over the working class relied entirely on his ability to deliver jobs. If the jobs dried up, his authority and Tammany's grip would shatter. "The L project is next," They'll finish the essential segments and stop. You and 3,000 other men will be on the street by Christmas." The looming storm brought with it a renewed sense of desperation that Elias recognized too well. It was the same chilling echo of the Irish famine, only now it was economic, not agricultural. He saw men who had been saving for years pull their money out of the failing banks, only to be mugged on the street corner. The lung-block tenements, which had been bad before, became breeding grounds for illness and starvation again as entire families were evicted. The crisis intensified the brutality of the Tammany system. With jobs scarce, the machine tightened its control, demanding fierce loyalty for the few remaining favors. Ward boss Fitzwilliam's demands became less subtle. "If you want your name on the list for the relief work, O'Connell," he sneered, "you need to make sure the competition doesn't even breathe near the job site." Elias understood. The economic downturn was transforming Tammany from a transactional system of patronage into a zero-sum game of survival. The pact he made in blood had bought him a brief reprieve, but the storm was threatening to sweep away everything: the pay, the dignity, and the future he had built on the steel girders. He walked home one night, staring at the unfinished sections of the elevated line towering over the city, a skeletal monument to interrupted progress. The construction was not just steel. It was hope, and that hope was being choked by a financial panic he couldn't fight with a cudgel or a vote. Elias knew he had to find a different kind of leverage, a different door, before the city's economic foundation crumbled entirely and took him down with it. The Panic of '93 had squeezed the life out of New York's construction industry, leaving Elias and thousands of others stranded. Red McBride, despite his fiery rhetoric, could no longer conjure jobs. His authority was fading, and his desperation was growing visible. The final segments of the elevated line were stalled, but there was one small, coveted source of guaranteed wages: a rush contract to repair a structurally compromised pier for the powerful Cunard shipping line. This job, though small, was a lifeline immune from city budget cuts. Red was convinced he could strong-arm the Cunard dock manager, Mr. O'Malley, into giving the contract to his union faction. "O'Malley owes me Elias," Red insisted one night, his voice hoarse. "I put his nephew in the police academy last year. Go to him, remind him of the favor, tell him Red McBride is still holding the cards." Elias went to the Cunard office with a profound sense of foreboding. He knew the political climate had shifted. The financial elite, now facing ruin, were less tolerant of Tammany's strong-arm tactics. Mr. O'Malley, a thin, nervous man, listened to Elias' demand with a tired expression. "The pier repair contract," O'Malley finally stated, adjusting his spectacles, "is already awarded, Mr. O'Connell." "Awarded to whom?" Elias asked, trying to keep the anger from his voice. O'Malley slid a small, folded pamphlet across the desk. It was an advertisement for a rival, independent construction company, one notorious for hiring strictly non-union, cheap labor. "They offered a price one-third of what your faction would charge, Elias. The Cunard line is not playing Tammany's game right now. We are trimming the fat to survive." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Tell Red McBride that his nephew at the police academy is now under investigation for taking payoffs. He's lucky if he keeps his badge, let alone his pension. The machine is cracking, Elias. Don't be standing too close when it falls." Elias returned to Red, not with the contract, but with the chilling news. The information should have sobered Red, but instead it unleashed his latent fury. "The snake is lying," Red roared, smashing a bottle against the wall. "Fitzwilliam and the rest of those greedy sachems have been cutting deals behind my back. They sold this contract to keep O'Malley silent about the police bribes. They're sacrificing me to save their own necks." Red lunged at a map on the wall, pointing a shaking finger at the pier. "We will take that pier by force tonight. If we can't have the job, no one will. We will prove that ignoring McBride costs more than hiring him." The plan was a suicide mission, an act of blind defiance that would guarantee Elias and the others would be blacklisted for life, perhaps even imprisoned. Red was no longer a leader. He was a drowning man trying to drag everyone down with him. Elias, standing on the precipice, felt the raw, brutal weight of the copper key in his pocket. He had made a pact of blood to survive, but this act would mean certain ruin. He remembered the words of the dock manager: "Don't be standing too close when it falls." Elias looked at his mentor, the firebrand who had pulled him out of the mire, and saw not a comrade, but a threat to his hard-won life. He stepped back. "I can't, Red," Elias said, the words tasting like ash. "This isn't war, this is suicide, I'm sorry." Red's eyes, once burning with passion, now flashed with pure, murderous hatred. "Then you are no better than the rats we left in the fields, O'Connell. You're a coward and a traitor." Elias didn't argue. He turned and walked out of the office, the sound of Red's furious shouts echoing down the hallway. He hadn't betrayed a friend, he had betrayed a movement. But by choosing survival over loyalty to a doomed cause, Elias O'Connell had finally, irrevocably, chosen himself. Elias knew his time in New York was over. The betrayal of Red McBride was not an act easily forgiven by Tammany Hall. It was a breach of the fundamental code of the machine. The moment he walked away from the pier, he became a loose end, a threat to be neutralized. He couldn't risk waiting for the inevitable retaliation. A late-night visit from a few of Red's muscle or a quick, unjust arrest from a grateful police patrolman. He spent the next few hours liquidating everything he owned, which amounted to little more than his savings from the L construction, carefully sewn into the lining of his coat. He kept his work boots, his sturdy canvas coat, and his copper key. Everything else was disposable. His destination was the West. The word itself was a myth in the crowded, cynical East, a vast, unbound promise whispered by those who had failed in the cities. It represented opportunity far from the docks and the tenements, a place where the rules were perhaps different, and where a man's background mattered less than his immediate utility. Elias bought a ticket at the cavernous Grand Central Depot, paying the exorbitant fee to the ticket agent with barely a tremor in his hand. The ticket was a passage to Chicago, the first major hub, but his sights were set much further. The Rockies, the silver mines, the last frontier of opportunity that the Panic of '93 hadn't completely strangled. He boarded a train under the cover of a freezing, late-night drizzle. He didn't take a proper seat. He found a spot in a packed, grimy railway car meant for low-paying immigrants and itinerant laborers, indistinguishable from the men who had been his companions in the tenement. He settled into a corner near the window, the rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels on the tracks instantly becoming the soundtrack to his flight. As the train slowly pulled out of the city, Elias kept his face pressed to the glass. The tenements, once looming and oppressive, retreated into a dense, dark mass. The unfinished skeleton of the L, the symbol of his lost stability and the source of his brief pride, vanished into the shadows. He didn't feel relief. He felt the cold, hard weight of isolation. He had cut the ties that bound him, both good and bad, and now he was truly alone. The journey became a blur of endless plains and shifting skies. Days melted into nights, fueled by stale bread and the occasional cup of weak coffee bought during brief stops in anonymous, dusty towns. He listened to the conversations around him. Farmers complaining about low grain prices, prospectors arguing about geological surveys, and traveling salesmen spinning grand, improbable tales of wealth. He realized the West was not a paradise. It was a furnace, a place where fortunes were made and lost with frightening speed, often on little more than a whisper of gold or silver. The economic panic had simply decentralized the desperation. The machine in New York was built on political graft. The machine out here, Elias surmised, was built on pure, reckless ambition and risk. As the train crossed the Mississippi River, the landscape outside transformed. The tidy, fenced-off fields of the East gave way to a massive, sweeping expanse. The open plains, an unsettling sight for a man accustomed to the claustrophobia of Cork and Manhattan. Elias took out the copper key, no longer a reminder of a door that was locked, but a symbol of the future he now had to build entirely on his own terms. He was fleeing one dangerous game only to ride headlong toward another. Elias finally stepped off the train in Denver, Colorado. The air here was thin, sharp, and clean, carrying the scent of pine and high desert, a welcome change from the smoke and rot of New York. But the city was only a temporary stopping point. His true destination lay beyond, toward the peaks of the Rocky Mountains, the promised land of silver and copper. He secured a spot on a stagecoach headed northwest into the mountains, joining a collection of men whose faces were etched with the same blend of desperation and ambition. Grizzled prospectors, nervous investors, and a pair of uniformed soldiers. As the coach pulled away from the last vestiges of civilization, the landscape began to consume them. The untamed territory was not simply vast. It was monumental. The mountains rose in jagged, snow-capped teeth, dwarfing the hills Elias had known in Ireland and making Manhattan's skyscrapers look like child's blocks. The sheer scale was humbling and terrifying. In New York, the fight for survival was against other men, against disease, and against the crushing weight of politics. Here, the enemy was the earth itself. The roads were little more than rutted trails clinging to the sides of perilous canyons. The rivers roared with glacial melt, unpredictable and lethal. And the temperature swung violently from day to blindingly sunny, to night when the frost bit deep enough to crack rocks. Elias, with his sturdy constitution forged on the girders of the L, was better prepared for the physical hardship than most. But his street smarts were useless here. He didn't need to know which ward boss to bribe. He needed to know how to read the clouds, how to build a fire that wouldn't betray his position, and which animals to fear. The stagecoach driver, a taciturn man named Silas, became his unwilling tutor. "You city boys always look up," Silas commented one afternoon, spitting tobacco juice onto the dusty trail. "You look up at the money you're chasing. Out here you look around. Up is just rock. Down is where you freeze. The real dangers move horizontal." Silas pointed a whip toward a distant ridgeline. "That whole range is riddled with fortune and failure. For every silver strike that makes a man rich, there's 100 collapsed tunnels that bury him alive. The earth will take your life faster and cleaner than any thug in the 5 points." Elias observed the other passengers. He learned to identify the gold fever in the eyes of the prospectors, a crazed optimism that bordered on madness. He saw the cold, calculated risk in the investors, men who saw the mountains only as columns of numbers on a balance sheet. He felt the copper key in his pocket, a steady, warm weight. The key had represented a locked past. Now it felt like a counterweight to the sheer, dizzying emptiness of the landscape. He had traded the claustrophobia of the tenement for the terrifying agoraphobia of the mountains. As the stagecoach bumped its way deeper into the mineral-rich territory, passing abandoned cabins and the silent, dark holes of played-out mines, Elias realized the ultimate truth of the West. It didn't care about his lineage, his betrayal, or his name. It offered a clean slate, but only at the cost of his absolute reliance on his own resourcefulness. He was stripped bare, with only his skill from the L and the desperate grit he learned in the city to see him through this beautiful, deadly wilderness. His real apprenticeship had just begun. Elias found temporary work in a small, struggling silver town nestled high in the Rockies, but silver, like the panic, felt like a dying industry. The true whispers in the saloons and boarding houses were about copper. Copper was the future. The age of electricity, telegraphs, and power lines required endless miles of copper wire. While silver had enriched a few speculators, copper would power a nation. His construction experience, his apprenticeship in steel and sweat, had taught Elias to recognize structural potential. Silver mines often followed fragile, unpredictable veins, making them prone to collapse. Copper deposits, by contrast, were often massive, igneous veins. They required engineering, stability, and scale, not just luck. It was in a dusty, high-altitude tavern, warmed by a roaring potbelly stove, that Elias first heard the full tale of the Killarney's Key. The storyteller was an aging, one-legged prospector named Jedediah, who claimed to have panned every stream from Montana to Arizona. Jedediah wasn't drinking for pleasure. He was drinking away the memory of his failure. "She wasn't silver nor gold," Jedediah slurred, pointing a gnarled finger at a map scrawled on the back of a beer napkin. "She was copper, but veins thicker than a man's torso, near a plateau they call the Widow's Peak, about 3 days north of here." Jedediah explained that the original prospector, an Irish immigrant like Elias, had named the claim after his hometown, Killarney. He had located the immense deposit, but his luck had run out before he could file the claim properly or secure the financing to extract the ore. The man had perished in an avalanche, leaving only rumors and a vague, hand-drawn map. "The key, son," Jedediah rasped, leaning close. He said the key to the claim was in the rock formation itself, a specific angle, a measurement, pure engineering, not prospectin' nonsense. Nobody's figured it out, and the claim is still legally open, too remote, too dangerous for the big companies. Elias' pulse quickened. The story resonated with a bizarre, almost mystical familiarity. He pulled the tarnished copper key from his pocket, the relic of his past life in Cork. He knew the connection was likely coincidence, but the specific mention of engineering and measurement spoke directly to the skills he had honed on the L. He studied the old prospector's crude map, the lines referencing geological features rather than familiar landmarks. He recognized a notation, a formula for calculating structural load capacity, scribbled near an X. The original prospector had been a structural man, just like Seamus the foreman, just like Elias. The key wasn't a physical object. It was a conceptual one, a piece of forgotten engineering knowledge. The next morning, Elias packed his bags, trading his last few dollars for a sturdy mule, basic provisions, and a small miner's pick. He left the silver town behind, refusing to share his plan with anyone, knowing that a claim this valuable, even rumored, would invite immediate and lethal competition. He headed toward the desolate wilderness of the Widow's Peak. He was no longer running from Red MacBride or the shadows of Tammany Hall. He was moving toward the massive, silent heart of the untamed territory. Elias realized that the true reward wasn't the copper itself, but the chance to apply the brutal knowledge he had learned in New York to build something real and lasting. A fortune built on steel and sweat, not blood and betrayal. The key to the claim was the key to his freedom, and he was determined to find the spot where the old engineer had buried his secret. Elias located the Killarney's Key claim near the Widow's Peak, just as Jedediah had described, a remote, high-altitude plateau. He found the telltale rock formation and, using his knowledge of structural load-bearing angles, identified the hidden marker. It wasn't a hole in the ground yet. It was a promise in the rock. Elias had legally staked his claim, marking the boundaries with weathered posts and a carefully written deed. He spent the next few weeks digging exploratory shafts, confirming the incredible density and quality of the ore. The copper was rich, and the structural integrity of the mountain suggested a massive, stable deposit perfect for large-scale mining. Elias O'Connell, the tenement scavenger, was on the verge of becoming a mine owner. His isolation, however, was about to be violently interrupted. One afternoon, as he was charting the vein, two riders emerged over the ridge, not grizzled prospectors, but men with the clean, hard look of corporate muscle. They wore dusters over clean suits and rode expensive horses. Their leader, a broad man with a tight, cruel mouth, dismounted near Elias' primary shaft. "You've been digging on territory belonging to the Great Western Mining Syndicate, son," the man stated, his voice flat and menacing. "I'm Mr. Thorne. Pack your tools and leave your markers. We'll forget we saw you." Elias stood his ground, gripping the handle of his pickaxe. "This claim is legally staked. I filed the deed in Gunnison County." Thorne smiled, a cold, empty expression. "Laws are for city folk, O'Connell. Out here, ownership is determined by who has the teeth to keep it." The conflict was raw and direct, but Thorne's next words delivered a sharp, unexpected jolt of fear that was far worse than any threat of violence. "We know who you are, boy. We know about your time on the New York docks, and we know about Red MacBride and the night on Pier 17. Elias froze. How could they know? The only people who knew the full truth were those in the Tammany Circle, thousands of miles away. Thorne saw the recognition in Elias' eyes and pressed his advantage. "The syndicate needs men who understand leverage, Elias. We don't care about your past, but we do care about your talent. You have a skill for finding structure and a proven ability to handle delicate situations. MacBride has been quiet for months, but he's not dead and he still has friends." Thorne pulled out a small, folded paper, a contract. "You can have a choice. You can fight us for this claim, lose your claim, and face the syndicate's resources and your past catching up to you. Or you can sign this. We give you a substantial percentage of the claim, a good salary as our chief engineer, and guaranteed protection from any New York complications. We can make Red MacBride disappear forever." The test was not a physical fight. It was a moral reckoning. The new opportunity, immense wealth, legitimate authority, and a chance to truly build, was being offered through the door of his old life's corruption. Thorne was offering Elias a new allegiance to a grander, more powerful machine than Tammany, one that operated across state lines and controlled millions. Elias looked at the vast, silent copper vein and then at the contract. He could choose independence, purity, and immediate war, likely losing everything. Or he could choose the opportunity, a legitimate career based on his hard-won skill, purchased at the cost of his conscience, by aligning himself with a new corporate ruthlessness. He would trade the small, tarnished copper key of his past for the immense, gleaming power of the Great Western Syndicate. He took the pen Thorne offered. The signature was slow, deliberate, and definitive. He chose the opportunity. He chose power. The pact was made not in blood this time, but in ink and ambition. 2 years after signing the contract with the Great Western Mining Syndicate, Elias O'Connell stood on the lip of the Killarney's Key mine, no longer a desperate immigrant but the company's chief engineer. The mine was a monument to his skill. He had designed the shafts, overseen the installation of the massive stamp mills, and ensured the structural stability that kept the copper flowing out of the mountain. He received a hefty monthly salary and substantial dividends. His name was spoken with respect in Denver and even whispered in the financial districts of Chicago. He owned a house in the growing mining town of Gunnison, a comfortable clapboard structure with electric lights, powered, ironically, by the very copper his mine produced. He had fine woolen suits, a leather-bound ledger instead of a worn valise, and a sense of authority that terrified the men he now commanded. Yet, as he looked out over the chaotic, industrialized landscape of the mine, the steam, the smoke, the rhythmic, deafening crash of the machinery, Elias felt a cold, sterile emptiness that the finest suit couldn't warm. He had achieved the American dream, but the price had been steep. The syndicate's ruthlessness was far more absolute than Tammany's transactional corruption. Where Tammany stole votes, the syndicate stole livelihoods and sometimes lives. Thorne, now his immediate superior, pushed Elias to cut every corner on safety to maximize output. "We don't need to over-engineer, O'Connell," Thorne would say, his voice devoid of concern. "A few accidents are cheaper than lost production days." Elias, the man who had learned the sacred trust of steel from Seamus on the L, was now forced to betray that trust daily. He authorized shafts that were too narrow and bracing that was too thin. When a young Italian laborer was crushed in a poorly supported tunnel, Elias signed the accident report detailing minor negligence, a lie that protected the syndicate but cost him another piece of his soul. The men who worked under him, Irish, Italian, and New Slavic immigrants, looked at him not with the admiration he craved, but with fear and resentment. He was one of them, yet he stood on the other side of an insurmountable class barrier, enforcing the system that exploited them. He had bought his way out of the tenement's shadow only to become the very thing he once despised, the privileged arm of a ruthless machine. His personal life was just as hollow. He had money to spare, but no one to share it with. He sent generous drafts of money to Cork, but the letters he received were respectful yet distant. He was a benevolent stranger, no longer a son. One night, sitting alone in his well-appointed parlor, he pulled out his old copper key. It was still tarnished, still small, and now felt insignificant against the immense fortune he had amassed. He realized the real key to the claim was not the engineering formula he had used to find the ore, but the moral formula he had used to attain power. Betrayal plus compromise equals authority. He had thought that escaping New York meant escaping the blood pact, but he had simply transferred his allegiance from a small, local corruption to a vast, continental one. His conscience was a constant, low-grade fever, a reminder that his success had not been built on his skill alone, but on the silent sacrifice of his principles. The fortune was his, but it felt like a chain, binding him tighter than the poverty he had fled. He was free from want, but captive to his wealth. The breaking point arrived not with a financial disaster, but with a collapse, the inevitable, terrible result of the safety shortcuts Elias had been forced to authorize. A major tunnel buckled deep within the Killarney's key mine, trapping a crew of 12 men. The syndicate's orders, delivered coldly by Thorne over the telegraph, were to seal the shaft to prevent a wider collapse and minimize liability. Elias knew that was a death sentence for the trapped crew. Standing outside the caved-in mine entrance, watching the desperate faces of the miners' wives and children, Elias felt the accumulated weight of his success crash down. The copper key, his link to the cottage in Cork, felt less like a symbol of the past and more like a shackle forged in greed. He realized the true price of his fortune, the betrayal of his core engineering principle, the sacred trust of steel and stability. In that moment of clarity, the definitions of wealth and home shifted entirely. Home wasn't a geographical location, nor was it a bank account balance. It was the structure of his integrity. Ignoring Thorne's threats and the syndicate's dire warnings, Elias took command. He didn't use the massive machinery he oversaw. He used his own hands and the expertise gained under Seamus. He organized a small, volunteer crew of miners, men who still trusted each other more than they trusted the company. He utilized old, discarded plans and his knowledge of the mountain's unique geology to start digging a narrow, parallel escape shaft, relying on speed and precise structural judgment. For 36 brutal, unceasing hours, Elias worked alongside the men, caked in sweat and copper dust. He wasn't the chief engineer. He was the structural laborer from the L again, his body responding to the primal need to build stability out of chaos. He measured, he braced, and he drove the effort with a focus that stemmed not from ambition, but from atonement. When they finally breached the tunnel and pulled the last living miner to safety, the moment was silent, profound. The trapped men were alive. The crowd outside didn't cheer for the syndicate, they cheered for Elias. Thorne arrived the next morning, furious, to deliver his ultimatum. You saved the men, O'Connell, but you ruined the company's protection. You're fired, you're sued. We will take your house, your salary, and bury you in debt. Elias merely smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile he hadn't worn in years. He handed Thorne his resignation, his voice calm. The fortune you offered me was never worth the price you demanded. I already paid you the cost of my time. You can keep the house and the salary. He walked away from the mine, not toward the train station, but toward the simple, high-altitude town. He still had the copper key and the clothes on his back, but he was no longer fleeing. He settled in Gunnison, opening a small, independent consultancy, advising smaller mines on structural safety. He lived simply, his reputation for integrity becoming far more valuable than the syndicate's stock portfolio. The American dream, Elias finally realized, was not the accumulation of wealth that led to isolation. It was the ability to build a life where one's skill served one's conscience. He had traded the manicured corruption of Tammany and the sterile ruthlessness of the syndicate for the honest dust of the mountains. Here, surrounded by people he had saved and men who trusted his word over a contract, Elias O'Connell, the immigrant who came seeking shelter, finally found his home. The copper key now symbolized not a locked past, but the integrity of the foundation he had finally laid.